So happy to see so many people here this evening for what promises to be a really incredibly special evening for all of us, and particularly for those at the Mark Twain House and Museum, for whom Joyce Carol Oates has been somebody we really wanted to have come speak with us for so long. So we're delighted and honored to have her with us this evening, along with our dear friend Christopher Beha from Harper's Magazine. So I'll be introducing them more formally in just a moment. Before I do that, though, I just have a little bit of housekeeping to do. And so bear with me while I point out a few things. We're in Crowdcast, which is the platform that we've been using since April 2020 for our virtual programs. And we've had so many wonderful authors here to talk with us. And we look forward to the day when we can have them all, including Joyce and Christopher, come to the Mark Twain House to do it in person. But from now, this is really special for us. So in Crowdcast, I see that you've all discovered the chat already. Please continue to chat away throughout the program. That's one of the fun things about these virtual programs. So make friends. Let us know where you're tuning in from, please. And any other information you want to share with us, we'd love to have it. But Joyce and Chris have agreed to a question and answer session toward the end of our program. And if you have a question for either of them, rather than put it in the chat where it might be hard for us to find, if you could stick it down at the bottom of your screen where you see the Ask a Question feature, that would be very helpful to me when I come back on toward the end of the program to manage that part. So another fun thing about the Ask a Question feature is you can look at other people's questions, and if you have the same question, you can click to upvote it, and that moves it toward the top of the heap. So I look forward to that part of the program very much. Also in the chat, you'll see an offer from Harper's Magazine. So we've had this wonderful relationship over the past few months where Harper's and we have presented a number of authors, really fascinating, great writers. And this is in that series. So just another addition that we're very excited about. But as part of the program, Harper's has made available a very special subscription offer only for people who participate in these Mark Twain House programs. So I believe it's $16.97 for an annual subscription, and that includes access to the archives, where I think that you can even find some Joyce Carol Oates, and I know you can find some Mark Twain. So it's the best deal going. I subscribed immediately when we started the series, and I have not regretted it for a moment. I look forward to my Harper's Magazine in my mailbox every month. So take advantage of that offer if you can. Another thing you'll see in the chat, and I'll be reposting throughout the program, is an opportunity to purchase a signed copy of Joyce Carol Oates' new book, Breathe. And if you're not yet convinced you're going to want to buy this, I know you will be by the end of the program. Now, we're no dummies at the Mark Twain House and Museum. We know that you can purchase this elsewhere, but do know that if you purchase it through us by following that link, not only do you get a signed copy, which is not the case all the time with other retailers, but also your purchase supports the Mark Twain House and Museum. And that brings me to my next point. If you'll bear with me to look at that big long green button under our faces right now that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House. Truer words were never spoke. We have weathered COVID so far through a lot of hard work, a lot of just kind of dogged sticking to it. We've offered these programs throughout to stay engaged with our communities, but it has not been cheap. It has not been free. And the programs are usually free for you and the audience, but they're not free for us to put on. We are now back in business offering our major revenue source, which is our guided house tour. And we're thrilled to have people coming in hordes to see the Mark Twain House. We're very careful about COVID safety, but we've been selling out week after week after week, and we're very gratified. But we are playing catch-up ball. So if you are able to share with us anything, $5, $50, anything that you are willing to part with to help support the Mark Twain House and Museum and its mission, I just want you to know that on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum, every single penny is deeply appreciated and put to very good use. And tonight's program, like all of our virtual programs, is supported in part by a gift in honor of the memory of Frank Lord, a former trustee and beloved person who we lost last year. So let me introduce our guests. Christopher Beha. Some of you know him from these programs. He's the editor of Harper's, and he is the author of the recent novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. And we had him talk about that earlier in the year. So Christopher, welcome. And Joyce Carol Oates is the author, as we all know, of more than 70 books, including novels, short story collections, poetry volumes, plays, essays, and criticism, including the national bestsellers We Were the Mulvaneys and Blonde. And I'm not going to go into all of her other honors because I'd rather let her talk, but I do want to let you know that she is the Roger S. Berland Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University and has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1978. Christopher and Joyce, welcome to the Mark Twain House and Museum. So delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And call me back up, Christopher, when it's time for questions and answers.
I will. Thank you, Jennifer, for that. Thank you, Joyce, for being here with us tonight. Jennifer has already introduced Joyce a little bit, and she is truly someone who does not need an introduction, but I thought I would just say, given the sponsors of the evening, a few relevant things about Joyce. One having to do with Mark Twain. Among the things, many things that have distinguished Joyce throughout her career is her engagement with the great 19th century American writers, which have been a sort of abiding fascination of yours, I'd say. And that includes a great deal of your critical work, but also some fiction, including the wonderful collection Wild Nights that has stories written from the point of view of a number of major American writers, including Twain. So you have not just written from the outside about Twain, but made the effort as an imaginative writer to inhabit him. So it is appropriate that we're here under the aegis of the Twain House. And then the other is your relationship to Harper's, which dates back to toward the beginning of your career. I went and looked in the archives, and the first thing I saw was a story from 1971 that was published in Harper's. Certainly, we have been, in the time that I've been at the magazine, one of your consistent homes for your short fiction, including a wonderful story that we published just earlier this year. And for those of you who don't know, I will also mention my personal connection, which was that going on 20 years ago, Joyce was my undergraduate thesis advisor and has been a really stalwart supporter of me and my work since then, for which I'm endlessly appreciative. So whenever I get a chance to chat with you, it's a nice occasion for me.
It's wonderful, yes.
So we are here to discuss your new novel, Breathe. And I can say a little bit to start about it, but it is about a married couple, Michaela and Gerard McManus, who travel from Cambridge to New Mexico, where Gerard, who is a Harvard professor, a very prominent Harvard professor and historian of science, is on a fellowship. And they plan to go for this, I think, 6 or 9 month period that he's on this fellowship. And very soon after their arrival, he falls ill, and it sort of spins out. From there, I'm sure we will say much more as we go about what happens. But I did think we might start with this setting of New Mexico, and the dynamics of this couple, and Michaela, particularly her experience going through her older husband's illness. It could potentially have been placed in all sorts of different places, and you decided to place it here, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, the novel, in a way, is like emotional autobiography, because at the center of it is personal experience, which did take place in the West rather than the East. So the photograph on the cover, which has been, it's been altered so that it doesn't look like a, travel brochure, was taken in Bryce Canyon by my husband, Charlie Gross, my late husband. And this landscape is very lunar. It's beautiful, but it's very impersonal. And if you are basically from the East, it's a different kind of consciousness. In the East, we have our tree lines are very close. Like when I look out the window here, the trees are really up in the sky. Whereas out in the West, there are no tree lines. There are horizons, vistas that may be many, many miles away. So there's a sense of a kind of destabilization of one's consciousness. Also going to this part of the world, which is rather like Santa Fe from the East. In Princeton here, we're probably at sea level. It's probably like 0 feet and a kind of humid and swampy air. And going west to Santa Fe, one is at 7,000 feet. So the title of the novel is Breathe. The first thing that you experience when you're somewhat destabilized there is you can't really get your breath. So the whole novel has this intensity about it that it's almost like it permeating the novel itself rather than just one person who's afflicted. The novel has a kind of relationship to another novel I wrote a few years ago called The Man Without a Shadow, which is an exploration of amnesia, the exploration really of the human psyche, and our brains or our minds undergo strange alterations when we have a trauma, for instance. And this
there's a concept that comes up quite a bit in a number of different contexts in the book, which is the out of time out of time. They have this idea that just in going from Cambridge to New Mexico, they're going to have this opportunity to be sort of out of time, out of their normal life, their normal routine for a little while. And then when the husband gets, diagnosed with, quite advanced cancer, then there is this idea that they wish they could step out of time, the time being the progression of the disease, to sort of talk through it and plan it out. And then there is the kind of out of time feeling of trauma and grief, or the out of time of death itself being out of time. And so this place, this sort of almost lunar landscape of New Mexico also has this sense of it as the place where, for them at least, they are out of time.
Yes, then one is sort of let out into it. There's a kind of yearning, like a gravitational pull to go out into that space, to in some sort of existential confrontation with all that you've lost, which is very different from being a kind of cushiony interior world where we're not really confronting such extremities. I know I certainly felt that. When my husband was in the hospital for about 6 weeks, I was at his bedside a good deal. But then when I left, I would be in this landscape it was a very hilly landscape. It wasn't literally Santa Fe, but a landscape very different from what I'm used to in Princeton, of hills, going up and down hills, and there being a kind of connection between the stress that you're feeling emotionally and a kind of stress that's physical. So I wanted to suggest all that. And also I do suggest in some of the little passages that are in italics that it's very possible that this couple brought to the West an infection that they got in the East from swimming in a warm lake where the microorganisms, which usually would die off, are no longer dying off quite as they did in our environment, in which climate change it's been so disruptive. Even as I speak, there's a big thunderstorm, sort of a thunderstorm here, and things seem much more unpredictable now than they did, decades ago.
Since you've brought up these autobiographical elements, I wanted to talk a little bit about the voice of the book, which has this very sort of incantatory style where we're very close to Michaela, the wife character, and a reader, as is often the case in your work, really gets swept into this consciousness and brought along the story that way. And what I actually want to talk about is the process of writing something like that, whether you are in that kind of swept along incantatory mode while you're writing, or whether that's an effect that you sort of sit in an analytical way and say, how can I create this effect for my reader?
No, I really began it right away in around April 2019. So the earliest material is called Hospice Honeymoon. That's the first thing that I wrote, where I had this fantasy that there would be a hospice and it could be like a honeymoon. There are all sorts of strange, but I guess fascinating tricks that the mind plays when some state of denial. But I'm very interested in how the personal, which is we all inhabit our subjectivity, sort of shifts to the transpersonal, that we think we're in our own personality, but suddenly we're having experiences that belong to our race. You know, like I suppose being born would be one of them. We don't remember that. And dying is probably something like that because it's a transpersonal experience. So though I'm writing about individual people who are, you know, characters in fiction, I'm also writing about the experiences that they're undergoing, which are surprising to them. I mean, I know that I've had experiences that I didn't ever anticipate that I would have, but suddenly you're sort of swept along in a current, it's like a river, and what you're experiencing is not necessarily limited to you. I can read a little passage in a minute.
Yeah, if you'd like to, that would be great if you'd like to go ahead now.
I'll read a passage that exemplifies this, because much of what I'm writing, much of all my writing is really exploration of a kind of philosophical points. I mean, I'm a fiction writer and I do love the physical, visceral world, the visual world also, but I'm interested in these ideas. So this is just a little chapter. It's a complete chapter, but it's only one paragraph in italics. And the novel is so structured that you have more or less conventionally longer chapters and none of these very short italicized prose poems. The man who never dreams. He has claimed that he never dreams. You have told him maybe you just don't recall your dreams. Oh, but he insists it's analogous to amnesia. If you don't remember an event, it hasn't happened. What isn't imprinted in the brain doesn't exist, quote unquote. It hasn't really happened. But you protest, but of course it has happened. If you feel pain, you felt pain. No. If there is no recording of the pain in your brain, it didn't happen to you. It may have happened to a living sentient being, but if your brain didn't record it and you have no memory of it, it didn't happen to you. Now, I don't know how you feel about things like that, Christopher. I find that so fascinating.
I do too, and I was going to note that Gerard, the husband, is what the human brain is the topic of his sort of grand academic work. That he, you know, is a historian of science, but he's very interested in Spinoza, and he's bringing in these philosophical undercurrents or linguistics or things like that to understand these subjects. And clearly a big concern of yours, but of the book is, as you said, the subjective experience, but how it is that, you know, we have this chemical matter that is our brain, and then we have these things that are subjective experiences that are individual subjectivity, and then we seem to have at moments, as you say, these times where we are kind of transcending ourselves to something that is larger than ourselves, which can't really be accounted for by the sort of biochemical accounts of the brain.
Yeah, to me, it's fascinating. If you don't remember something, literally don't remember it, did it actually happen to you? I mean, it happened in an objective sense, like if somebody could take a photograph of it. But if it's not literally imprinted in your brain and in the neurons and you can't retrieve it, it didn't in a way happen to you. It may have It's like a loop. It did happen, but it didn't necessarily happen to you if you don't remember it. It's a principle of anesthesia. We evidently don't feel the pain, but if we did feel some pain, we wouldn't remember it. So we didn't really feel the pain.
And just as there can be things that happened but didn't actually happen to you, there can be things that happened to you but didn't actually happen. One might say, in the sense that they can't be objectively verified as external facts, but that you did experience them. So, Michaela has these increasingly sort of surrealistic experiences that she knows, or the reader knows. It's not actually possible that these happened in an objective sense, but they have the feel of real subjective experiences for her.
Well, if you look at a text like the Turn of the Screw, which, all of our writing, including your novel, which is ultra realism, so social realism, but they're all textures of language. And so the question is it possible that within the context of the work of art, anything that happens in it's presented in it, actually it happens as much as anything else? Like we think that we don't believe in ghosts. You and I don't believe in ghosts, and yet there will be times in our lives when we're haunted by some memory or some person, or it could be a voice of someone who's no longer living. You have a dream in which somebody is presented to you who's no longer living so powerfully that it's like a psychic experience. And it's really happening in your brain, even though it's not objectively true. So we speak of being haunted by someone, or somebody else, haunted by a ghost. There's an actual ghost that's down in the boathouse or whatever. But we don't speak in those terms because we don't believe in that.
But can on that note, can you talk a little bit about the role that some of the Native American pantheon of the Southwest plays in the book?
Yes, so it's very important for me. When Gerard goes out to this place that's a little bit like Santa Fe, and he's at an institute, he's very interested in endangered languages. If you know much about endangered languages, you know that there are hundreds of languages that are about to become extinct. And a number of those languages belong to Native American tribes, where there may only be a few people living who speak the language anymore. Some of them are quite elderly. When a language is in the province of elderly people and it doesn't have young people to keep it going, it's almost extinct. So Gerard is very interested in that phenomenon of these languages about to pass into oblivion. It's been characteristically and traditionally white linguists and historians who do a lot of work in this field. And is it some sort of appropriation of that language to not allow it to pass into its natural oblivion, but to kind of artificially rescue it? And I'm not trying to be racist and say there's anything wrong with being white. Obviously, I don't think there is, but it's a sort of white predilection to sort of reach in there and preserve something as part of the white linguist career. You're making a career out of dealing with these almost extinct languages. Then Michaela gets interested in this, but not as much as Gerard was, because she didn't really know he had this interest. This is very recent. So when she's looking at his manuscript and trying to make sense of it, she encounters that. But Michaela is more like most of us, I think. We're not really that educated in the local deities or the gods that were once worshipped in a certain part, let's say, of the Southwest, before there was a United States. A long, long time ago. What are these deities that were very powerful Is there any way that we could comprehend these? Now, I don't really go into it, but it is very well known that Incas and Aztecs of Latin America had vast sacrificial rites connected with, I think, the solstice, where thousands of people were sacrificed. I think their living hearts are torn out of their bodies. I didn't get into that very much in my novel because that's a whole other subject. But,
you speak about appropriation, and the way that she's first introduced to these gods is through these kind of figurines that are in the apartment that the Institute has given them. And they're very off-putting to her in a way that the revulsion goes beyond what can be rationally explained. But her justification is that they're tchotchkes, they're kind of kitsch, and they probably weren't even made by native people. They're probably, sort of tourist reproductions of these things.
And they're invented by me, but they're not very different from, Hindu gods of destruction, gods that are really demons that are really gods. The Christian idea that there's a savior who's all good and his mother was born without sin, that everything is very benevolent in the Christian iconography. But other religions are very willing to consider that their gods are also their demons, and that the God of creation is also the God of destruction. So Christianity doesn't really accommodate this breadth or this depth. When Michaela goes to that part of the world, she's kind of shocked, and some of the images are somewhat obscene by conventional bourgeois standards, that parts of the body are emphasized in ways that we would feel inappropriate, or we would be cringing or be embarrassed. So she's hiding them around the apartment. Her husband teases her, like, what's wrong with you? They're not that bad. He was thinking of buying some and bringing some back east with him. But it's sort of like we can't fathom it. She can't fathom it. Then she goes to a museum later in the novel, and she's sort of seeking her dead husband out in the world. And she learns about the history of the white Spanish conquistadors and other settlers to the West who just do terrible things to the indigenous people. There are millions and millions of indigenous North American peoples who were just eradicated. Their numbers plummeted. And she's sort of stunned by that, which I guess I was also. We were not taught that in high school. We're not taught any of this in public school. I'm sure not even today, which is more politically correct. We're just not taught about the Native American slaughters and the kind of genocide that was practiced by the white people from Europe. So Michaela is sort of reeling from that. It's conjoined with her own personal sense of being very destabilized.
Michaela is also is a writer of memoir, and obviously one of the ways that she is trying to make sense of this is through language, but she finds herself sort of unable to write, and she's teaching while she's there, and she has a student who seems very promising. She's teaching a creative writing workshop, who seems like a very promising student to her, based on the first couple of assignments, who experiences a trauma and finds herself unable to write. And I was interested in that idea. Not least, of course, you are known for being very, very prolific, and I was interested in your treatment of the idea of the way that a trauma might itself keep you from writing, which would potentially be the thing that could help you make sense of the trauma and maybe get over it.
Yes, well, there are two students with whom Michaela interacts. One is a young woman who evidently, we gather, she's been sexually abused. She says she's been raped. And it seemed that probably something very extreme has happened to her. And Michaela wants to help her. And we are all told, I think all of us in the universities, you have to report these things. You know, there's a place you have to report them. Also, they're crimes. If a crime has been committed, you should report it. But the girl just makes her promise that she won't tell. So I wanted to explore that ambiguity. If a young person comes to you and says, I will tell you what's in my heart, but you have to promise not to tell anybody, you sort of have to say yes. I mean, I can't imagine saying, no, don't tell me. I mean, you sort of just naturally say yes, but then having said yes, you're in a kind of trap, because then you learn that there's been a rape, probably. And so you can't really, fulfill your obligation. So Michaela gets into this situation. It's one thing that is bothering her quite a bit. It does work itself out. Eventually, it turns out it's not as tragic, or it's not as irrevocable as she had thought. But then the other thing about loss and grieving, we grieve for the person we've lost, but we also have lost the love and care that we lavished upon that person. So Michaela is confronted with these two students where she suddenly feels she's got a lot of care and a lot of concern. She wants to help them. And particularly the second student, who's an older student. He's a young man. He's about 29, and she's about 37, I think. So he's about 29 years old, and she doesn't feel for him an erotic or romantic relationship, but she feels for him a kind of deep care. He's somebody who's never going to be perfectly well. He has a chronic respiratory condition that I actually did some research into. It doesn't get much worse, but it never will get better. So he'll always be a semi-invalid. So she's lost her husband, but she hasn't lost that wish to care for another person. And I don't know if I made it too subtle, but he does give her a letter, which she doesn't open, but she doesn't throw out. So I like to think that she takes it sort of out of the novel. We don't really know what's coming after we finish a novel. There's a kind of trajectory we can imagine, like what is going to happen at the end of Crime and Punishment, what's going to happen at the end of War and Peace. And at the end of a novel, people don't just die or stop on the last, sentence. So it's quite possible that she will open the letter and that she will decide that she will have a connection with this person whom she might be able to help in some way.
This is sort of switching tracks a little bit, but it goes a little bit back to the question of the writing process itself. And I wondered, you write in many different genres, but also, within your novels themselves, there are books that I would call more or less self-consciously acts of genre, and then there are books that are, I want to say more freely written. I don't want to say they're more literary, but just simply that it doesn't seem like you are trying to conform to the constraints of any genre, so in this book, you are giving yourself full free play to do all of the things you want in terms of bringing in these ideas and in terms of the tone and everything else. And I wonder how conscious you are when you're sitting down of that distinction that I'm drawing, whether that distinction means anything to you, or whether it's all sort of just writing to you.
Well, I wanted to cast the novel in such a way that one could read it as a realistic novel, and you could just sort of read it all the way through. It wouldn't exactly explain some of the tale-of passages, but I wanted to so structure it that a person who was reading maybe more carefully or is used to reading speculative or slipstream fiction, not necessarily reading realism. I wanted to seem like a realistic novel. But somebody who's trained to sort of look at these things metaphorically can also read the novel as if the whole thing is a fever dream of Michaela's, because there are these sections where somebody is holding someone's hand and saying, I will never abandon you. That's the great terror of our time, especially since COVID came along, that we are going to die all alone, on a respirator or a ventilator, and nobody we even know is going to be there. So when I wrote the novel, it was COVID had not yet come along, but I was sort of anticipating the sense of how we need not to abandon one another. We must be with one another when the loved one dies. That's the most important thing that we can do for, say, a loved one, to be there. You can't stop the person from dying, no matter what you can do, but you can try to make that transition to death as relatively beautiful or peaceful or meaningful as possible. So there may be people listening to what I'm saying who've had the experience. Then you know that it's like the high point in one sense of your spiritual life, that you were there to make this transition for somebody else. And Michaela may be the person whose hand is being held. I wanted to make it just ambiguous enough that if one wanted to read the novel a little more deeply, you could say, well, this is a fever dream of what looks like a realistic experience, but in fact, she is the one who's at the brink of her own extinction. Or if you want to read it as a realistic novel, she's coming back home and she's got this letter from Simon, and both can be true in life. I have enough of a romantic streak to want to think that she is coming back with the letter, rather than thinking that she herself is expiring.
But you said you spoke about these moments of attending to someone's death as a high point of someone's spiritual life, and I was struck by what a spiritual book this is. It's the setting is this is called Santa Tierra, Holy Land, and they have gone on this kind of a sort of pilgrimage, a kind of this it is in this out of time setting, but at the same time, it's Gerard in particular seems like very much the type of a rationalist, a historian of science, a Spinoza, and all these things, and so he, as you mentioned, has a very different response to these religious artworks than Michaela does. He thinks it's a nice decorative thing to maybe bring home and have on the shelf in Cambridge to remind us of our time in New Mexico, but he doesn't think of it as something that is charged with some kind of power.
Yes, I think that's very true. And he's more of a materialist. Most scientists are materialists, and most scientists are determinists. So you and I are more, humanistic people. Right. When you meet a person who's actually a determinist and a materialist, at first you sort of think that they're being metaphorical, but they're actually not. And it's kind of interesting, this kind of clash where we think in terms of metaphor. Like, I don't have any difficulty as a pretty agnostic or deeply skeptical person. I don't have any difficulty writing and certainly reading Gothic literature, in which all sorts of surreal things are happening, sort of bubbling up out of the unconscious. It doesn't really seem to me that is not part of our human experience. But our rationalist, extreme rationalist, doesn't even want to read fiction. He doesn't want to read anything that's not real. He doesn't want to waste time reading anything that's not real. Whereas you and I would say, well, it's it's real metaphorically.
Right. And it's speaking to return to the earlier thing, to subjective experience, which is something that can't be captured in this materialist sense. Yeah. Well, I really love this book, and I could talk for a long time with you about it, but I know we have a big crowd here, and I think we probably have lots of questions. So I am going to bring Jennifer back in to read some of these questions for us.
Well, first of all, how fascinating. Thank you both so much for sharing all of that with us. And yes, we do have a number of questions, so we'll get started. But first, Joyce, I just want to tell you, I never knew that about anesthesia, that it wasn't so much that it just made you not feel the pain, but it made you forget, or makes you forget that you had felt the pain. That is really fascinating to me. So thank you.
Ever notice that you wake up right away? You can be out for hours, but you don't experience that duration of time. You wake up right away. Like, where did it go?
That's fascinating. Thank you. So we do have some great questions, and Sean wants to know, can you talk about the origin of where you are going, where have you been? Such an amazing story. So many of us read that story when we were in college as part of an anthology, and it was so influential. So I think a lot of us would like to know about where that story came from early in your career.
Well, thank you for that question. It's always an interesting question to look back upon my own career. It was completely accidental. I was leafing through a copy of Life magazine, which was in a library. It wasn't even my own. And I happened upon an article called The Pied Piper of Tucson, Arizona. This is way back in the 1960s, before the term serial killer was coined. That's how long it was. Okay, this person, Charles Schmidt, was what we would now call a serial killer. He preyed on teenagers in the Tucson area and in the area like the desert. He would, I won't go into the details, but I read the article very quickly. And then I sort of closed the magazine, and I didn't really necessarily think about it. But I went away and thought, well, I'd like to write about this Pied Piper of Tucson. And I was thinking about it, but ultimately I wrote a story called Death and the Maiden was my title, which I had appropriated from German woodcuts of death approaching the maiden. They're medieval woodcuts. So Death and the Maiden was my actual story. And it wasn't about the serial killer very much at all. It was about the girl. So something happened between my reading the article. I mean, maybe a few days went by. And then when I started writing the story, it was from the point of view of a 15-year-old girl who would be a victim. Now, many, many years later, I did write something called Zombie, which is literally from the point of view of the serial killer. And why it happens that we do things at some point in our lives and we don't do them at other points, I have no idea. So that's the genesis. It began with Charles Schmidt, and you can look him up. I'm sure he's online. But my story is totally invented. And of course, Connie is a fictitious person. Then when it was made into a movie by Joyce Carol Oates and Tom Cole, they took it one step farther. It's called Smooth Talk. And now it's about a family. So it's like the family of the girl, with a lot of wonderful scenes of girls, a girl with her mother and a girl with her girlfriends at the mall. So the story has gone through these different metamorphoses, beginning with something in Life magazine, then my story. I changed the title, Death and the Maiden, of course, to Where You're Going, Where You've Been. And then the movie, Smooth Talk, which is another kind of metamorphosis.
I love how organic that is. It's not, it doesn't sound at all like, okay, this is what I'm going to do next. It seems like it just kind of evolved in your mind. Thank you. So Nancy Beha wants to know, Ms. Oates, would you ever consider writing a memoir? And I believe you have, correct?
Well, I've written a couple of memoirs. One is called A Widow's Story, and the other is called The Lost Landscape. So maybe I'll write another memoir. I love the form. I love to read memoirs. I think memoirs are a wonderful genre, and they're very difficult. They're difficult to find the right tone.
The
But
memoirs you write, that you have written, I think, and you can correct me if you have different view. They're memoir in the sense, to the extent that it makes sense to draw a distinction between an autobiography and a memoir. They are records of particular periods in your life of going through things that are closely tied to the personal experiences of those moments, the way they've affected memory and whatnot. But and then you've had some volumes of your journals published, which are a kind of ongoing autobiography. But you haven't done the sort of the full arc of your life story, kind of.
that doesn't appeal to me at all. How would you even begin?
Yeah.
We all are interested in memoirs, which are very delimited. There's a memoir of crisis, which is very, very popular in our time, where some awful thing has happened to somebody, but they've triumphed over it. So that's the memoir, and it's very finite and kind of a work of art. But an autobiography would just be sprawling and formless, and it doesn't seem to me that one, unless you're making it sort of a Nabokovian,
Right.
gesture of some kind. To write an honest memoir, I think an honest autobiography would be extremely difficult.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So this one, I think it is for you, Christopher. What? I'm going to go back to it, make sure I get it correctly. Well, one of our audience members wants to know what's the best advice you ever got about writing from Joyce Carol Oates as your writing mentor.
I actually know, I can give you the answer to that. She said, "Don't pull your punches." Which was an appropriate boxing metaphor for a great writer about boxing. I was working on a novella, and it had sort of chapters that I would bring her weekly. And at the end of one, it's three friends, and they've gotten involved in this sort of very poorly conceived drug deal. But at the end of one of the chapters, one of them is it's two boys, two young men and a young woman, and one of the young men has had a drug overdose, and the ambulance is sort of coming for him, and it ends on this kind of dramatic moment of the ambulance coming to take him away. And she asked me, how is the next chapter going to begin? And I said, in the next chapter, they're sitting in his hospital room, and he's sitting up talking to that, whatever, And she said, well, no, he dies. And I said, does he really? And she said, of course he does. This is fiction. It's supposed to be dramatic, and you've created this great the situation between the three of them, and then and I said, well, I thought it would be I think I probably said I thought it would be overly sentimental or something like that, which is one of the great fears that I think young writers have, is sentimentality, and it leads them to sort of
I don't know, Chris, I feel like you've frozen. Am I the only one seeing that?
He does seem frozen. Yeah. I'd love to know what the title of that novella was.
Well, until he thaws, I'm going to ask you a question, which is, Joyce, was there ever a time in your life where you considered being anything other than a writer? And what might that have been?
Oh, well, I was really trained to be a teacher. I'm showing my cat sleeping.
Oh, hi, cat. Remind us of your cat's name.
Lilith. And she's extremely overwhelmed and excited by the intellectual exchange here. As you can see, she's totally asleep. Well, yeah, I've always been attracted to, for instance, art history, if I didn't go into literature. Now, Christopher seems to have just disappeared.
Disappeared altogether.
So
I'm going to guess he'll find his way back in. He knows the ropes here, and I'm hoping that he'll follow the link and come back and maybe refresh his browser. But we can continue talking, and there are a lot of audience questions you can answer on your own.
I was worried about being considered sentimental, so some sort of god of wrath just eradicated him completely now.
Oh, dear. Oh. Anyway, so that you wanted to be, you originally thought perhaps of being a teacher?
Oh yes, I was going to be a teacher. I loved being in school, and I loved my teachers. I really, really loved my teachers. Almost every teacher I ever had, I felt school was just wonderful. And I went to a one-room schoolhouse out in the country, so it's like the only place. It's like, Wallace Stevens. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and there was this the slab surrounded it. So this was a place where there were books and there was penmanship. We were taught, there was arithmetic, a very nice teacher. And I was in a very fairly impoverished part of Western New York State where there just were no books except in the schoolhouse. So all my memories of my teachers are very positive, and naturally I wanted to be a teacher.
That's a real tribute, but I think we're all grateful that you turned out to be a writer rather than a teacher. And you just invoked another of Hartford's writers. Wallace Stevens was a Hartford native, and so let me just see the next question. Ms. Oates, Kenneth says, I've read most of your stories and books, but as a busy physician and parent, not yet breathe. Anyway, regarding your haunting, to me, short story character Arnold Friend, whose identity has always remained obscure, I guess it needs to stay that way to retain the mystique. Can you talk about Arnold Friend?
Well, I had said that the original title of the story was Death and the Maiden. And
okay, so that's, yeah.
I had a kind of Hawthornian, Nathaniel Hawthornian vision of writing an allegory in which death would appear, but not as a stereotypical image of death, but just as this young guy who's a very phony semblance of Elvis Presley. That's basically, he was pretending to be someone like that. Or Marlon Brando in The Wild One, that sort of image of a male machismo, but in a very kitschy, kind of campy way that a young girl wouldn't know, wouldn't quite realize was not genuine. So Arnold Friend is that emblem of death, but he shows up at the shopping mall. It's not a German woodcut of great beauty and surpassing tragedy. It's something very ordinary.
Fascinating. Thank you, Kenneth. I hope that answered your question. Eliza says, Ms. Oates, your novels and stories are intriguing. How would you describe the changes in your vision from your earlier work to what interests you today? Your work always contains realism, but unafraid to tackle differences there. Anyway, so yeah, that is a good question. I'd love to hear your answer.
It's a very good question because there has definitely been a change. I've always been interested in writers like Kafka and Thomas Mann and James Joyce, who sort of move between the realism and surrealism. But the difference is that at some point in my writing career, maybe around the 1990s, I'm not sure when it began, I got much more interested in dramatizing people's voices so that people in my novels, my fiction, welcome back, Christopher. We didn't know where.
Chris, thank you.
I'm more likely to dramatize people speaking in their own voices, whereas decades ago I would narrate a story. Now I'm more likely to have it be mediated through the voice of a character. So I'm very interested in the human voice. But when I began, I don't think I probably felt that I could do it. I didn't necessarily even try to do it. Since I've been writing more plays and since the 1990s, the play, of course, is the human voice. And so I'm much more interested in that.
Well, welcome back, Christopher, as
Thank
Joyce
you.
said. I'm glad we didn't lose you all together. I'm still fielding audience questions, but I have another one of my own. Who do you read? Who? And I guess I'll separate that into two. Who living do you read, and who no longer living do you read, and especially appreciate?
Well, I'm sure, like Christopher, that I mean, my answer is that I'm reading various things that come in. I have galleys, bound galleys, some of them from former students of mine, which I'm reading. And I mean, I actually not going to say the name of a writer, a young writer whom I taught in Berkeley. He has a novel, his first novel. So I was just literally reading that about 1 hour ago. So that's the sort of thing that I'm reading, and I'm sure Christopher is also. And I tend to read my former students' work.
Mm.
Up with it.
Yeah, I read a lot of the reading I'm doing is sort of adjacent to my editing work. The last novel that I read, purely because it was something that I wanted to pick up, was a novel that you may have read, Joyce. The Joy Williams's first. I think it's possible that you even reviewed it. Joy Williams's first novel, State of Grace.
Mm.
Ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd read most of her stories over the years, but I had not read one of her novels, and I decided to pick this one up because she writes a novel every 10 years or so, or something like that, and she's got a new one coming out later this year that I wanted to read, and so I thought I would go back, and it's really fantastic.
I don't want to say very unique, because that seems to be redundant, but she really is a unique voice. I think I know Joy a little bit. It just might be that her whole consciousness is a little strange.
Yeah,
Al Greco's vision or something, because when you read something by Joy Williams, it's not like anything else by anybody else.
Yeah, you can tell the difference, I think, between a writer who is able to imagine themselves into consciousnesses that are maybe a little askew from reality, or people who try to have sort of certain eccentricities in their fiction that maybe come off as a little mannered because they're consciously trying to make it seem eccentric in these ways, and someone who really is a sort of eccentric sensibility, and the books are a real record of that sensibility.
Yeah, I would put in that first camp, say, Saul Bellow. He can mimic different kinds of speech, but it's always Saul Bellow, and he's very, very verbal, very intellectual, and driven by ideas. And he's a wonderful, wonderful writer, but he's always so sane. It's always,
Yes.
always Saul Bellow.
Yeah, even when he has these characters that are a little, but he for someone who obviously was in a way a real intellectual, in a way that not all writers are, even great writers are, he was very interested in sort of crackpot intellectuals.
Yes.
Which is, he saw the real humor in the intellectual's drive to fit all of life's experiences into some grand system, a Hegelian system, or into Rudolf Steiner's system or whatever.
Right, and he also was transfixed by these reality teachers, these people who were not at all intelligent, but they had a kind of a low cunning, very charismatic. There are characters like that in Thomas Mann also.
Yeah.
You have the protagonist, who might be a young man or a man, and then you have this other shimmering kind of semi-human, sort of diabolical presence that can't somehow be comprehended, but is immensely attractive.
You bring up Thomas Mann, and I have been rereading him recently, and I reread Buddenbrooks, which is a really fantastic novel. And the first time I read it was on your recommendation. It was the summer before my senior year, and you sent me a note, and you said you should read Buddenbrooks, which Thomas Mann wrote when he was not much older than you are now. It's a great senior thesis, as you described it. And of course, it's one of it's up there with the Magic Man. I mean, it's one of the great novels of the last 150 years. So to be given it and told this is what he did when he was 20 something years old was a bit overwhelming at the time. But
isn't that interesting? He was only about 23 maybe when he started it, and those chapters are short, and it's ultra realism. It's socio. Yeah. I mean, for a young writer like you to read something like that, I don't want to sound ridiculous, but not beyond your ability to fathom the way, say, Ulysses would have been.
Right.
It's realism, and he had a theme. The theme is the title. It's the downfall of
family. Yeah.
something that a bright young person like you could actually learn from.
And what was interesting about him is that Buddenbrooks, which comes out in maybe 1901 or 19 or something like that, when he's quite young, as you say, it's really a 19th century novel. It's like one of the last of the great 19th century novels. And then, he's writing for another 50 years, and 25 years later, he's doing Magic Mountain. But, another 20 years after that, he's doing Dr. Faustus. And he came so far from this classic realist 19th century novel by the end of his career.
Right. Well, I would never have given The Magic Mountain to a 20-year-old because that's something different. And I would never give Dr. Faustus. But but Death in Venice is a good combination of seeming realism, lots of sociological detail and historical detail, but then moving into this allegorical and this other world. I could see giving that and also Heart of Darkness to a young writer.
Wow. There are times when I just pinch myself at how lucky I am to be privy to conversations such as this tonight. Thank you both so much. But we're not finished yet. I want to ask the standard question because so many people in our audience are writers or aspiring writers or just curious about the writing life. So I'm going to ask you both, what's your writing routine? How do you get this stuff done?
Christopher, why don't you begin?
William Gaddis, in talking about it, why he didn't want to submit to a Paris Review interview, he referred to writers getting asked the question, which side of the page do you write on? And he thought that there was this idea that you would be, writers could give you the magical key if you just knew their routine. My routine for a long time before my two children were born was that I would get up early and I would write for a few hours in the morning before I went to work. And I although it doesn't work right now for people whose lives allow for it, I'm a big proponent of it because you get up early and you're still in a bit of that liminal state. And your conscious mind hasn't entirely taken over, and also you can tell yourself, I'm going to write when I get home, or I'm going to write later, but things come up during the day, and if you do it right away, then it's done. So I'm a big proponent of that. And then if you get home and you still want to write, then all the better, you keep writing. But that was my routine. Now I'm with my children in the morning, and things have to get figured out. But the answer now is I do it whenever I can.
Well, my work on say a novel really begins with going running and walking. I spend a lot of time running and walking really very fast and sometimes bicycling. And at that point, I'm thinking of something like a cinematic entity. It's like I'm looking at a movie, or I'm trying to imagine a movie that will be the chapter that I'm working on, or a short story. So my routine really begins with thinking or dreaming very, very consciously, sort of figuring things out as I'm moving along. And I really love to run very much. In fact, if I can't run, I probably can't even write. Then I come back home and write in longhand very rapidly, and I remember what I've been thinking. And at some point, I will have a whole folder of these scraps of paper. So that's my routine. And when I finally go to the computer, it used to be to the typewriter, it's really passed through a few stages of thinking.
And when you're in that, you say it's cinematic, but do you mean that it comes to you in images, or it is language? Even in its earliest state.
No, it's not language, but it doesn't come to me. I have to go to it. I'm kind of exploring it. Like you say you're doing your own movie, like Alfred Hitchcock evidently imagined every scene in all his movies. Evidently, he knew the whole movie in his head before he actually filmed it. So I would say it's something like that, but there's no language necessarily. No.
That's very inspiring. So Joyce, have you been to the Mark Twain House?
But I would love to visit sometime.
We would love to have you, and Christopher, I think you need to come with Joyce, and
Get
we'll
there
give you
eventually.
toured. So one of the things I always like to say is the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. And Christopher has been a member of our circle of writers now for some time. But Joyce, I hope you'll consider yourself a member of our circle of writers associated with the Twain House and with Mark Twain, about whom you obviously have written. And I hope you'll come visit us as soon as it's safe to do so. And we'll show you a good time. We'll give you a tour and take you behind the scenes and take you up into the archives and all kinds of stuff.
I think we may be getting some cats.
I think.
I have a beautiful cat here, but she's playing coy.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We would love to see her, but
She's on the bed.
that's Lilith is cooperating.
Has hardly moved, but I get this one.
Please do. And while you're doing that, I'm once again going to hold this book up. I cannot imagine that you have anybody who sat through this conversation and not jumped at the chance to purchase this book. Again, we have a signed copy for you. It's going to take a few days or maybe a week or so to get it to you because, just 1 second. Let me finish my pitch for your book and then I want to know more about the cat. The vagaries of the postal service and all kinds of things have slowed things down, but we will get this book to you as soon as we possibly can after this event if you order it through the link, and I'll repost that in the chat. But please do support us that way and tell us, Joyce, about that beautiful creature in your arms.
Well, this is Zanchi, who's a Maine Coon, and she is going to join the Mark Twain House. She's going to send a contribution tomorrow.
Well, we look forward to it. And I'm sorry, what is her name again?
Zanchi, it's a Spanish name.
Oh, well, she's beautiful. She's big. She's big. So Mark Twain loved cats. He adored cats, and he had dozens of them at a time with all kinds of crazy names. And so he would very much like to know that both of your cats were now part of the family.
Did he have dozens of cats? Because that's a bit much.
No, he did.
Somebody else was taking care of the cats, probably a woman.
Well, I do know that the girls were very interested in animals and but he loved the cats, and he had a billiards room and billiards table, and he would let the kitten of the hour sit in the pocket and bat the billiards balls away, and he adored cats. So
I want to come up and visit, and I will definitely do that.
Well, let's make a plan, and we're counting on it. And Christopher, join us, please. And
okay.
Audience, as always, you always have the best questions, and we're so grateful to have you here with us. Thank you for your donations to the Twain House. We're so grateful for them. And Joyce and Christopher, thank you for a wonderful evening. It was even better than I thought it was going to be.
Thank you. Thanks, Joyce.
Good to see you.
Good night, everybody.